Wonderful. Well, first of all, hello and welcome to this fine dinner where Labor ideas for a better future will be well and truly discussed. Congratulations to those who brought it together. Can I begin by just saying how much of a pleasure it is to be here as a Senator from the sparkling city of Sydney and the state of New South Wales to join you here in our most European city, the glorious city of Melbourne. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be with us this evening, and ever mindful that it falls to our generation in this time to attend to the incredible inequality that still exists for our First Nations people across the country. When I was asked to come down here, I was delighted to know that it would be your own son of Victoria, Richard Marles, who would be giving the address in this most incredible period of time. And I want you to join with me in making your own son very welcome, Richard Marles. Thank you very much. And of course, I want to acknowledge my friends from the Federal Parliament, the wonderful Claire O'Neill, MP, from the red benches, where we need many more Labor senators. Can I acknowledge my very hard-working colleague and friend, Senator Raf Ciccone. And although I haven't spotted them, I have spoken to one of these gentlemen today. So Daniel Molino, is he here? Where is he? Oh, over here, fantastic. Sorry, I'm blinded by the light, Daniel. So Daniel Molino, and also Peter Khalil, I understand, is with us or joining us. Thanks very much. I'm going to hand over to Sebastian in just a moment, but to round out my important task to kick us off, none of these events happen without the investment of time and also talent and money. So I want to sincerely thank the major sponsors for gathering thought leaders to discuss important ideas for our country. So can I acknowledge the sponsorship of Maurice Blackburn, represented by CEO Jacob Varghese. And I do want to note apologies from Michael Cooney, but Michael Cooney Jr. apparently is in the room. Can I acknowledge, my very long-time friend and very significant political supporter, a man of great integrity and fantastic leadership for our movement, Gerard Dwyer from the SDA. And can I acknowledge apologies also from your own leader of the SDA here in Victoria, Michael Donovan, who sends his apologies this evening. We also have partners that exist outside of the movement, and that is so fundamentally important for us as a democratic country. And I want to acknowledge RSUS. Thank you for your ongoing support for this event. Earls Setchers from the PPTU Victoria, and also KPMG. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sebastian Zwolf. I'm a board member at the John Curtin Research Centre. Thank you very much for coming to our gala dinner this evening. I also wanted to acknowledge a few people who are here in the room. From our state parliament, John Berger is here. John, I think it's been a little while since you and I have been in the same room together. Nice to see you again, John. We have a number of former MPs here as well. We've got Nick Sherry is in the room. Nick, I think you and I spoke a couple of years ago about my postdoctorate, doctorate studies into infrastructure. Nick, thank you for your advice on that occasion. Theo Theophanis is in the room, a former minister in two state governments here in Victoria. Welcome, Theo. And Michael Danby, I believe, is in the room, a fantastic advocate for the Jewish community during his years in Parliament and since. Michael, thank you for your representation of our community. From the mighty trade union movement, we have Joe Mitchell here from the ACTU. It's been great to see the union movement in this country have an increase in membership over the last few years. Well done, Joe. From the RTBU, Alex Classens, National Secretary. Alex, I think you've had a promotion since we were last in the same room. Congratulations. Ronnie Hayden from the Victorian branch of the AWU, I think recently elevated to that role. Congratulations, Ronnie. From the National Union of Workers, or the organisation formerly known as, Greg Sword, a very long time General Secretary. For those who aren't aware, the NUW was a bulwark of social democracy in the state of Victoria. Greg, thank you for your leadership. Give Greg a round of applause. I'll also acknowledge Earl Setchers from the Plumbers Union. He couldn't be here, but thank you, Earl, and to that organisation for your support of the centre, and also to Jared from the SDA. Thank you. From our Advisory Council, we have David Cragg and Jeff Farry in the room. Thank you, David and Jeff. The Advisory Council gives the centre a lot of its intellectual thrust, and we couldn't do it without you, so thank you. I'm also pleased to say we've got 3 members here from the Curtin Research Centre Young Leaders Academy, several of whom have gone on to be Curtin Scholars, and that's Danielle, Lachlan and Tim, who are in the room tonight. So welcome to the 3 of you, and congratulations on your work so far. I think that concludes things for introductions. I think we'll have our entrees soon, and then Deb and I will be back shortly to introduce our keynote speaker, Deputy Prime Minister. Richard, thank you for joining us tonight. For those who don't know Richard, he has a storied Labor career. In about the year 1988, Richard was elected President of the Melbourne University Student Union. The year following, he was elected General Secretary of the National Union of Students. Following that, he became a solicitor and then a trade union official, and in 1998 was made Assistant National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union. In the year 2000, he was made Assistant Secretary of the ACTU, and in the year 2007, he was elected as the MP for Corio. During the Rudd government, he was the Parliamentary Secretary for Pacific Island Affairs, and later during that government, the Parliamentary Secretary for Trade. During the opposition years, he served as Shadow Minister for Immigration, Shadow Minister for Defence, later as the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party as well as Shadow Minister for Defence. And for the last almost 3 years, Richard has been our Minister for Defence and Deputy Prime Minister, overseeing, I think, the largest increase to our defence budget in generations. And Richard, thank you very much for keeping us safe in what are increasingly difficult global circumstances. Richard is also a father of 4. He's a husband. He's a keen golfer. He's a supporter of the Cats. No judgment. He's an avid photographer and a snow dome collector. I first came to know Richard in, I think, about the year 2014. I was an official at the ALP National Office, and Richard was a senior frontbencher, and we were going to have to work together on a few things. But I didn't know Richard, and I certainly didn't know much about him. And I think the only thing that I really knew about Richard, or that I could recall, was a couple of years previously, Richard had got me laughing as I read his column in the newspaper, where Richard had talked about over his summer vacation in, I think, the year 2012, how, being a good father, he'd taken his kids to the municipal pool, and being a good father had decided to follow one of his kids down the water slide at the municipal pool, and unfortunately this rather small children's water slide had got himself stuck in the water slide. And as the water was building up behind Richard, and in fact a couple of small children were as well, as Richard told the story, it dawned on him that perhaps he needed to do something about his dad bod. And Richard shared this story with the nation, so I'm sure Richard doesn't mind me repeating it tonight. He shared the story with the nation in a newspaper column as a call for people to do something about their health. And I sort of thought about this and I thought, well, this is a man who doesn't necessarily take himself too seriously on all occasions, and he's a man that I can work with. And we did. We worked together for 5 or 6 years when I was at the ALP National Office, and it was an absolute pleasure. I recall 3 things specifically about Richard. The first was that Richard had incredibly strong relationships everywhere. I was the ALP's International Secretary during that period, and from the Solomon Islands right through the Caribbean, there were people in politics and government who knew Richard and had a relationship with him from his role at the ACTU, where he looked after international affairs, especially those in the Asia Pacific. The second thing that I noticed about Richard was he had incredible attention to detail. Richard was a member or a proxy member of the National Executive for 3 or 4 years, and as the moderate official at the National Office, I used to go and brief Richard before National Executive meetings. And Richard always wanted to make sure he was across his brief and make sure that anything he was supporting, he knew the detail behind it. The third thing that struck me about Richard was what a deep and critical thinker he is. We spoke a lot about geopolitics in his office over those years, and I reflected that Richard always brought a very independent mind to what was going on in global affairs, where our allies were at, where our potential allies were at, and why it was that they might be thinking the way that they were. I learned a lot from Richard, and it was an absolute pleasure working with him. Richard, it's my pleasure to introduce you tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. We're all looking forward to your remarks.
But can I acknowledge among them Claire O'Neill, the Minister for Housing, and perhaps through her, all my parliamentary colleagues, federal and state, present and past. Can I acknowledge Gerard Dwyer and Alex Classens, and through them, all the union leaders who are here tonight, both present and past. And can I acknowledge my big sister, Vic Marles, who is also here tonight. I want to acknowledge Vic because when Vic told me that she was coming to tonight's dinner, I said, well, like, I'm used to speaking in front of Labor luminaries, but having my big sister in the audience is really going to put the pressure on. So anyway, it's great to see you here as well, Vic. We revere John Curtin as Australia's great wartime leader, standing up to Winston Churchill to bring our troops home to defend the country. His clarity of vision as early as November of 1936 about what conflict in the Pacific would mean for Australia. His understanding of great power relations with the United Kingdom, but also the United States. And on assuming office on the 7th of October in 1941, the way that in short order he organised our national defences, our national security in what would be our most perilous year of 1942. And yet in the popular press, John Curtin was an unlikely pillar of Australia's national security. He had grown up literally spruiking the virtues of socialism on soapboxes on the street corners of Melbourne. He was a union leader, secretary of the Victorian Timber Workers Union, and had played a leading role in the anti-conscription campaign in the 1916 plebiscite that occurred during the First World War. But Curtin was not a pacifist. Curtin was strategically intelligent, and Curtin was utterly committed to the Australian project, to Australian identity. In short, Curtin was an Australian patriot. And in all of that, Curtin was Labor to his bootstraps. Because one of the unheralded lineages of Labor philosophy is that the Labor Party is the true party of Australia's national defence. You can look at the great Prime Minister Andrew Fisher and the creation of the Royal Australian Navy in 1913, which to this day is the single biggest leap that's ever been taken in Australia's military capability. You can look at another Labor Prime Minister, a veteran of World War II, Gough Whitlam, who unified the three service departments into a unified Department of Defence in 1973. Or you can look at Kim Beazley, who gave rise to structured strategic thinking and policy in the DIB Review and the 1987 Defence White Paper, which really has served as being the blueprint for defence policy for 35 years. One of the great contributions that the Labor Party has made to our nation is through national security and defence. And yet again in the popular press, there would be a perception that defence is the brand strength of the Conservatives, of the Liberal Party. There's no doubt that the Liberal Party certainly believe in their own publicity. They have a defence conceit. But the consequence of that defence conceit is that in respect of defence, it has made the Liberals lazy. And this was never more exemplified than in the 9 years of the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government. Over that period, there were 3 prime ministers, but perhaps just as significantly, there were 7 different defence ministers, because they did not see the job of the Minister for Defence as a responsibility, they saw it as a trophy. Toward the end of the Rudd-Gillard government, a decision was made that we needed to settle on a replacement of the Collins-class submarines, the most important military platform that the Australian Defence Force has, with its end of life coming in the 2020s, right now. And yet, the Abbott government were in and out of an arrangement with Japan, and then the Turnbull and Morrison governments were in and out of a deal with France. It would not be for 8 years before the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government finally fixed on a solution. And indeed, we might argue that the only reason they fixed on that solution is that they were voted out of office 6 months later, and it was Labor that fixed it. They made an art form of making grand defence announcements without putting any money behind it in relation to ships, missiles, more soldiers. By the time we came to office, there were $42 billion worth of defence commitments that they'd made without a single dollar behind it. Fully 1/4 of what defence was required to procure, there was no money for. Now, obviously, that represented an enormous deceit on the Australian people. But what it also meant was that there was an army of public servants who were all working on various defence projects in the complete knowledge that not all of them could come to fruition because there simply wasn't the money. But which projects succeeded and which failed was not a matter of strategic necessity, but simply which public servants were doing better. And in that moment, the Liberals let go of the strategic levers of our nation. When they did spend money, they spent it badly. 28 different projects running a combined 97 years over time. They appallingly mismanaged relationships with our nearest neighbours. They literally made jokes of our neighbouring countries in the Pacific. They presided over a shrinking Defence Force in the time that Peter Dutton was the Minister for Defence. The Defence Force shrunk by 1,400 personnel. And what we now know through the Defence Strategic Review is that in those final years of the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government, secretly but effectively, they cut defence funding. All of that meant that the legacy of the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government was to give to this country a lost defence decade at a time when we could least afford it. When we came to office in May of 2022, it was completely clear that in the AUKUS arrangements there was absolutely no expectation of a new nuclear-powered submarine entering into service into the Royal Australian Navy until the early 2040s, even with an extension in the life of the Collins class. A capability gap had opened up of a decade. And so one of the first challenges that we faced was reaching an arrangement, which we did, with the United Kingdom and the United States, which will see us purchase Virginia-class submarines from the US that will be in service in the Navy, not in the early 2040s, but in the early 2030s, closing the capability gap. We engaged in a root and branch review of our strategic landscape, understanding that the former government was really operating on a set of strategic assumptions which dated back to the Cold War, and yet we live in a very different world, one in which we are seeing great power contest play out within our region, a contest the mode of which and the outcome of which is uncertain, and where we're seeing China engaging in the single biggest conventional military build-up that the world has seen since the end of the Second World War. Now, all of that means that our strategic landscape is far more complex, and indeed it is far more threatening. And the threat is not that Australia is about to be invaded. The threat is that Australia can be coerced. Because as an island trading nation, with a growing percentage of our national income being dependent on trade, we are very reliant on a rules-based order which underpins the physical economic connection of Australia to the world, our sea lines of communication, those sea lanes. And so the challenge for our defence force, for our military capability, is to defend those lanes, as it is to make our contribution to the collective peace and security of the region in which we live, because it's very hard to conceive of the defence of Australia without conceiving of the defence of the countries to our north. But the insight that comes from those two observations is that the geography of our national security lies less on the coastline of our continent, but much further afield. And what that in turn means is that in terms of the military capability that we must have, it has to be able to project. That's why we need a capable long-range submarine. But it's also why we need a highly capable surface fleet. And again, what we inherited was the oldest combatant surface fleet that the Royal Australian Navy has been putting to the sea since the Second World War, with no prospect of a new surface combatant entering the Navy until the mid-2030s. We've changed that. We've put the Navy on a trajectory of doubling the size of our service combatants, with the newest of them being received by Australia in the 2020s. We know that we need longer range missiles, and we know we need a quantity of them which will make our arsenal relevant. But to achieve that, we simply have to make them here. And so we're investing heavily in the establishment. We're investing heavily in the establishment of a guided weapons and explosive ordnance industry in this country, and that's not on the never. Indeed, the beginnings of that manufacture will happen this year. We have totally changed the relationships with our near neighbours in defence terms. A step up in what we're doing with Korea and with Japan. For the first time, joint sales with the Philippines. A defence cooperation agreement with Indonesia. Deeper and more extensive training with Singapore. The prospect of a defence cooperation agreement now with Papua New Guinea. Much greater engagement with Fiji and with New Zealand. For the first time, the Indian-initiated Malabar exercises being held in Australia. Remarkably, we have signed the first ever defence cooperation agreement between Australia and the United Kingdom, and force posture initiatives between Australia and America have also grown. We are dealing with defence recruitment. This year, we will enlist 5,800 personnel. That's the biggest enlistment into the Australian Defence Force since 2008. And it means that we can stand here on this day and say that at last again the Australian Defence Force is growing. And because we've got a strategic clarity in what we're doing, we are able to make difficult decisions, which makes the defence budget sharper and makes the quality of the defence spend so much better. But we also understand that we have to increase that spend, and that's what we've been doing. $50 billion in the budget over the next 10 years. More than $5 billion in the forward estimates. Together, they represent the single biggest peacetime increase in Australia's defence budget since the end of the Second World War. And it's actually happening right now. If you look at the financial year 23-24, Defence has spent its largest ever amount out the door on defence procurement. And this year will be larger again. But while we've been doing all of this, there is absolutely no sign that the Liberals have put their defence house back in order. They're still making policy on the run. We saw a couple of weeks ago an idea that if they're elected, they will purchase a new squadron of F-35s, as if there is an F-35 shop, which I can tell you there isn't. I mean, there's no prospect of any of those planes entering into service for years and years to come. But even then, the $3 billion which they've put aside for this, they acknowledge will not cover the maintenance and sustainment of the aircraft, will not cover their housing, importantly, will not cover the pilots who will fly them. I mean, the F-35s are an exquisite platform. They greatly increase the capability, indeed the lethality, of the Royal Australian Air Force. But it is to state the obvious that an F-35 sitting on the ground doesn't do anything. We've watched the Liberals breathlessly wave their fists at China as we have seen a Chinese Navy task group in the vicinity of Australia over the last few weeks, and they have implored our government to do something, but exactly what they would have us do is not at all clear. But what we have done is we have surveilled that task group in an unprecedented way with both naval and air force assets so that we know where it's gone, what it's done, the exercises that it has practiced. And that has stood in stark contrast to what the Liberals did not do 3 years ago when there was a Chinese Navy warship in the vicinity of Australia. They've utterly missed the point that in fact the Royal Australian Navy operates much more in the proximity of China than the Chinese Navy operates in the vicinity of Australia. And that's not gratuitous, that's because that's where our sea lanes are, that's where we need to be asserting freedom of navigation. But they would have had us fall into the trap of establishing a standard in relation to the Chinese task group here, which would have greatly inhibited the activities of the Royal Australian Navy there. And then, in the last 2 weeks, we have seen the astonishing, and might I say, the shameful stance that Peter Dutton has now taken in relation to Ukraine. Let's be clear. 3 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. And not by reference to international law, but by reference to power and might. And so what is happening there is a defence of Ukraine, but what is happening there is also a defence of the global rules-based order upon which we rely. And so first the Morrison government and then ours has stood in steadfast support of Ukraine over the last 3 years, $1.3 billion worth of military support. And we've understood that we have been doing that with the bipartisan support of the Liberal Party. But in the last 2 weeks, that now appears to be changing. There is the prospect from our friends and allies of a request for Australia to provide peacekeepers in a certain scenario. And what we have said in relation to that request is that we will consider it in good faith, seeking to do what we can, as we have considered every request that we've received over the last 3 years. But already, Peter Dutton has utterly ruled that out. He cites capacity constraints with the Australian Defence Force. He says that he doesn't want to see Australian personnel based in Europe, and yet there are already Australians serving men and women in Europe, in Great Britain right now, training the Ukrainian armed forces. And we hear astonishingly his shadow minister now say that he believes that the rules-based order is dead and buried. Well, we have a very different view. We stand with Ukraine, and we stand in the defence of that global rules-based order. And what we are seeing from the Liberals right now is a shameless attempt to create political division in respect of defence, because for them, defence is not about Australia's national interest. Defence is only about their political opportunity. And most astonishingly is the stubborn refusal of the Liberals to support Labor's increase in defence spending. All we get are these vague assertions that they'll always spend more, they'll always be better than Labor when it comes to defence. They ask us to accept the vibe of the thing. Defence philosophy straight from the mouth of Dennis Denuto. This next election will principally and rightly be fought on the basis of cost of living, on access to affordable healthcare, to education, on jobs and real wage increases. And we really look forward to that contest. But as you look at the news abroad, as you feel a sense of unease about what is happening to the world today, it's completely obvious that who governs Australia over the next 3 years will have a profound impact on our national security, over our defence and strategic policy. It will have an impact on the country that we hand to our children and to our grandchildren. The Liberals are offering nothing more than a chaotic set of ramblings, a return to the lost defence decade. When it comes to defence, they are lazy, they are indolent, and their ideas are harebrained and they are populist. What we offer is an Albanese government that will be thoughtful about our strategic circumstances, that will protect our national sovereignty, that will defend Australia. A Labor government in the grandest tradition of John Curtin. Thank you.